Welcome to Forbidden Tales. That evening promised to be perfect. I was sitting on the couch in our cozy living room enjoying the sound of rain. Outside the window the house, usually filled with noise and bustle, seemed strangely quiet. Michelle, my younger sister, had gone out for another dinner with her friends, and her son Ethan had slipped away as teenagers often do. Only Sophie, our fluffy ginger cat, and I were left to rule this kingdom of silence. I smiled watching Sophie sprawled on the couch like a queen on her throne. She half closed her eyes as if saying, "That's right, everything is under control now." This evening was a rare opportunity to relax and just enjoy the peace. After dinner I decided to take a hot bath. It was my favorite way to unwind, warm water and steam that seemed to wash away all the stress of the day. As always, Sophie decided to accompany me, lazily following me to the bathroom. She settled at the threshold, giving a light meow as if granting her approval of my plans. The water was already filling the tub when I turned the lock on the door, making sure it was securely closed. Sophie glanced at me, her look decipherable as, "Why do you need this? We're alone in the house." Her tail twitched with curiosity, but soon she lost interest and headed back to the living room. I sank into the wall water, feeling the warmth enveloped every cell of my body. Everything felt so right. The water, the steam, the soft glow of candles. The only sound was the raindrops hitting the windows. My eyes closed on their own, and I allowed my thoughts to drift far away, but soon a strange sound broke the silence. At first it was a barely audible creak, as if someone quietly stepped on the hallway floor. I timed, listening closely. The old house sometimes made such sounds, but this one felt too real. Probably Sophie, I reassured myself. She loved wandering around the house, especially when I wasn't paying attention to her. I continued enjoying the bath, but a few seconds later I heard something else. It wasn't just a creak. This time it was movement, like someone cautiously approaching the door. A chill ran down my spine, but I quickly told myself, "Don't be silly, it's just the old floors." Yet something kept me on edge. I looked at the door. The thin line of light beneath it seemed still, but then a shadow appeared there. It briefly crossed the light, then froze. My heart raced. I heard faint breathing on the other side, slow, rhythmic, too close. "Who's there?" My voice sounded louder than I expected, but not as steady as I'd hoped. For a few seconds nothing happened, and I began to think I'd imagined it all. But then a familiar voice came through. It was Ethan. "Sorry, and Claire, I didn't know you were here." His words were hesitant and his tone was filled with embarrassment. I sighed with relief, but something about his voice made me uneasy. He didn't sound like himself. "It's okay, Ethan, I'll be out soon," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice light. A second later the footsteps behind the door retreated. Silence turned, but it no longer felt cozy. Something about that brief encounter left a strange residue that I couldn't explain. When I emerged from the bathroom, Sophie met me at the door with a curious look, as if saying, "Something happened, didn't it?" I stroked her soft fur, listening to the silence in the house, convincing myself it was just a coincidence, but a thin thread of unease remained. The next morning I woke to the soft sound of Sophie's claws tapping across the hardwood floor. The room was cold, and sunlight crept lazily through the gaps in the curtains. Memories of the previous evening left an unpleasant aftertaste, but I tried to shake them off by focusing on my usual morning routine. When I went down to the kitchen I saw Ethan sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, which he'd apparently made too strong. His expression gave it away. Usually he was energetic in the mornings, but today his movements seemed slow. He didn't even look up when I entered. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Morning," he replied shortly, still not looking at me. Sophie, already in her usual spot on a chair, watched us intently. Her tail moved slowly back and forth as though sensing some tension in the room. I grabbed a cup and poured myself some coffee. Sitting across from Ethan, Sophie immediately jumped onto my lap, her soft paws resting on my pajamas, as if she were trying to comfort me. We sat in silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to think of something to say to start a conversation, but he clearly avoided eye contact, staring fixedly into his cup. "Did you get back late last night?" I finally asked, trying to sound as casual as possible. "Yeah, a little late," he replied. Finally looking up, his face showed a hint of embarrassment, as if he expected me to say something more, but I kept quiet. Everything felt strange. A side invisible wall had formed between us, and I didn't understand it. Sophie curled up on my lap, purring, but even her presence couldn't ease the tension. Ethan abruptly stood up. "I need to work on a project for school," he muttered, quickly leaving the kitchen. His footsteps echoed through the house as he climbed the stairs. I was left alone. Sophie jumped off my lap and followed him, as if suddenly curious about his behavior. I watched the go, feeling my own doubts grow with each passing minute. The day dragged on. I busied myself with cleaning, checking emails, flipping through books, but I couldn't concentrate. Questions kept spinning in my head. Why did the situation from last night still haunt me? Why did I feel so strange around Ethan? For his part, he barely left his room, which was unusual for him. By evening, I decided to make dinner. It was my attempt to bring a sense of normal back to the day. As I was chopping vegetables, Sophie suddenly appeared in the kitchen and jumped onto the table. Her eyes were fixed on the doorway as if she were expecting someone. Ethan entered a few minutes later, offering a restrained smile. His hands were tucked in his pockets and he stood there, seemingly hesitant to come closer. Smells good, he remarked just to break the silence. I thought we could have dinner together, I said, hoping it would ease the awkwardness. He nodded and sat at the table watching as I finished cooking. When I served the food, we started eating, talking about trivial things, schoolwork, Michelle's plans. Gradually the conversation felt more natural and it seemed like the tension was beginning to fade. But as dinner ended and I was clearing the plates, he suddenly stepped closer. My heart started beating faster. And CLA, he began quietly, but his voice faltered. I turned to look at him, surprised by how close he was. In that moment he leaned in slightly. His movement was slow, almost questioning, as if he were looking for reassurance. It lasted only a second. Our eyes met and I took a small step back, feeling my cheeks flush. Sorry, he said, quickly retreating. There was a flicker of embarrassment in his eyes and he hurried toward the stairs. I stood there trying to process what had happened. Sophie glowed at me with a narrowed gaze, her tail twitching as if she disapproved of both of us. The date only heightened my sense that something was changing, though I couldn't grasp what exactly. Night fell quietly, as if the universe itself had decided to give me time to reflect. The house was once again enveloped in silence, broken only by Sophie's soft purring as she settled on my lap. I was sitting in my room staring at a book that had been open to the same page for half an hour, but the letter seemed to dance before my eyes and I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the evening. Why had Ethan come so close? Why couldn't I just brush it off as an awkward teenage moment? Something between us had changed and I didn't know how to handle it. Suddenly, Sophie jumped up and trotted toward the door, her paws making soft taps on the floor. I looked at her, a bit startled by her sudden movement. The door slowly opened and Ethan appeared in the doorway. His face looked serious but slightly tense, as if he were unsure whether to enter. Can we talk? He asked. After a short pause, his voice barely above a whisper, I nodded, gently closing the book and setting it aside. Sophie, ever the guardian of calm, hopped back onto the bed, clearly not planning to leave. Her tail moved slowly back and forth as if she were carefully observing what was happening. Ethan stepped in, closing the door behind him, and stopped a few steps away from me. His gaze wandered around the room, though it kept returning to me, as if he were struggling to find the right words. I wanted to apologize for tonight, he began. His tone was quiet, almost remorseful. I didn't mean for it to come across as strange. It's okay, Ethan, I replied, trying to make my voice sound light. Sometimes these things happen. We just misunderstood each other a little, but my words didn't seem to help. There was still tension on his face. He sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumping as if admitting defeat in a battle with his emotions. I just feel that since I came back home, everything's different, he said, avoiding my gaze. It's like I'm trying to find my place, but I don't know how to do it. His words touched me. I had never considered how complicated his age might be, especially living in a house where you're constantly compared to someone else. I felt a wave of sympathy, but couldn't ignore the tension that lingered between us. Softly I said, Ethan, I understand that it's tough, but sometimes these moments are just moments. We all find our own way to cope. He looked up, his eyes held something new, a mix of gratitude and hesitation. His movements were slow, as if he feared disturbing a fragile balance. He moved a little closer and I felt the air in the room grow noticeably heavier. You're always so kind to me, he whispered. His words were unexpectedly sincere, and I saw him struggling with himself, as though trying to decide what to say next. For a moment the silence between us became almost tangible, and before I could say anything he leaned in closer. His face was so close that I could feel the warmth of his breath. It all happened too quickly, a gentle, almost weightless touch of his lips on my cheek. This wasn't meant to cross a line, rather it was a gesture of gratitude mixed with an attempt to express what he couldn't put into words. But even this brief moment made my heart race. I gently pulled back, putting all the warmth I could into the movement, and looked him in the eyes. Ethan, let's just keep being ourselves. Sometimes that's enough, he paused for a second then nodded, his expression softening. He stood up, casting a quick glance at Sophie, who seemed to be watching everything with wise, understanding. "Thank you, CLA," he said, quietly before leaving. When the door closed behind him, I felt the tension begin to dissolve. Sophie purred softly, as if confirming that everything was all right, but I knew this evening would leave a mark, even if it was a small one, on our story. The morning began unusually peacefully. I woke up earlier than usual and lay in bed for a few minutes, watching the rays of light filtering through the curtains. Sophie was curled up beside me, her fluffy side rising and falling in time with her soft breaths. In that quiet I felt a strange mixture of emotions: anxiety, relief, regret. The memories of the last few days were too fresh. I understood that the conversations with Ethan, his behavior, his actions, all of it was no accident. But what to do with this knowledge? I didn't have an answer. When I went down to the kitchen, Ethan was already there. He stood by the sink, staring out the window thoughtfully. It seemed he hadn't even noticed my presence. I cleared my throat to get his attention. "Good morning," I said, trying to sound casual. He turned, his gaze soft but cautious. "Morning," he replied, as if the words came with some difficulty. There was a tension in the air, but not the uncomfortable kind. It was more of a pause, forcing both of us to think carefully about what to say or do next. "Do you want some coffee?" I offered, heading toward the coffee maker. It was my way of easing the atmosphere, bringing back the normally that had been lacking in recent days. "Yes, thanks," he replied, sitting down at the table. We sat across from each other, exchanging brief remarks about the weather, the day plans, but both of us knew it was just a facade. Finally he took a deep breath and looked at me. "Claire, I want you to know I'm grateful for everything," he began, his voice sounding sincere but a bit tense, "for always being there, for understanding me even when I don't understand myself." His words touch me. At his age, emotions can be so intense that they're hard to express. I smiled, feeling that subtle warmth return between us, the foundation of our relationship. "Ethan, I just want you to be happy. Sometimes life places us in difficult situations, but we'll get through it," I said, looking into his eyes. His gaze softened slightly. He looked away, absent-mindedly turning his cup in his hands. For a moment I thought he wanted to say something, but instead he just stood up. "I need to go for a walk," he muttered. I nodded, and he left the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. By evening the house was once again filled with silence. Michelle was still at work, and Ethan had gone out to meet friends, saying he might be late. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea in my hands. Sophie, as always, was nearby, her amber eyes watching me closely, as if she knew everything going on inside me. I tried to read, but my thoughts were elsewhere. The conversation with Ethan that morning showed me he too felt the shift between us, yet like me didn't know how to handle it. I closed the book inside, looking out the window. After a few minutes I heard the front door open. Ethan was back. His footsteps were light, almost silent, as if he was trying not to disturb me. "You're back early," I noted when he appeared in the doorway to the living room. "Yeah, decided to come home," he said. His voice had a strange softness, and he walked over to the chair across from me, sitting down with his gaze lowered. We simply sat in silence, as though afraid to disrupt this fragile moment. Finally, he looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the same gratitude I'd heard in the morning, but now there was something new: determination. "Claire, I know it's sometimes hard to know how to act, especially when everything seems confusing, but I want you to know that you're important to me." His words were simple, but they carried everything I needed to hear. I smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Ethan, that means more to me than you might realize." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and quietly said, "We'll get through this, right?" "Yes," I replied. In that moment I felt that the tension between us had finally dissolved, giving way to clarity. The silence was once again filled with comfort, not anxiety. Sophie Gly jumped onto Ethan's lap, and for the first time in a long while I felt that everything was going to be okay. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this.